now. All right, welcome everyone to today's seminar. We're very happy to have Silvia Manconi from Aachen. Silvia did her PhD in the University of Turin, and then she was a postdoc at the University of Turin, and now she's a postdoc at Aachen. And she has worked and still works on several aspects of the phenomenology of cosmic rays and gamma rays. So for instance, for cosmic ray electrons and positrons, she has worked on anisotropies and multimeasure constraints on the local emission, interpretation of the AMS data. She also works on indirect detection of galactic dark matter with gamma rays and gamma ray emission from blazars, like a contribution from blazars to the extragalactic gamma ray background, for instance. And something I found interesting also is that Silvia works on applying deep learning, machine learning methods and neural networks to some astrophysical problems like classification of the Fermi lat sources and dark matter annihilation using cosmic ray antiprotons. Today, she's going to talk to us about an equally interesting topic that is gamma ray halos of galactic pulsars. We're very happy to have you, Silvia. Please take it away.
Thanks a lot for a very nice introduction and for having me today. I will try again to share my screen. You can see it full screen right now. Okay, great. I will start with this figure in order to introduce a little bit the topic of my talk. So imagine now that the Gemini constellation is passing through exactly this position in this Copenhagen landscape. I'm not sure, but maybe you can cross-check in a clear night sky. And your eyes are able to see gamma rays. I know this is not true, of course, we're going to see afterwards the detectors, but imagine that your mind is also mapping bright spots of gamma rays with yellow and dim spots with blue. And this was just because this was nicely reflecting in the water in this picture. Then what you will see in the gamma rays are the TV energies in the region of the Gemini constellation, in which the Geminga source is there, is this very large emission of gamma rays above 5 TeVs. And here you see the moon to scale, just to have a scale of the dimension of this emission in the sky. This is actually a COUNS map performed by the OC collaboration in this specific region in the sky, and we are going to use this map and the derivation of the measurement in order to understand the nature of those objects. At the moment, we don't agree really in the community about a name for the objects I'm going to talk about. So you find both the naming gamma ray halos, as I will use here, TV halos, because they were discovered in TV energies, gamma rays, also inverse Compton halos, if they want to use then the emission mechanism that we believe is supporting those halos. But we are going to see this in a moment. Of course, we don't rely on our eyes to look to the sky at gamma rays, but we have a family of observatories at the moment that can map the gamma rays from GeV to TV energies with sensational accuracy. So at the GeV energy range, we have the Fermi-Lat telescope that is measuring with very high accuracy up to a few hundreds of GeV, while in the TV energy range, where I will mostly concentrate in this talk, we have at the moment the ESSA, the OC, and the LASO detector that started recently to take data. And in the near future, we are waiting for the CTA detector, both in the north and the southern hemisphere. If you want to know what is the sensitivity for a given reconstructed gamma ray energy, you can have a look to this plot that was actually produced to underline the huge step in accuracy that the CTA northern array will give, but also the light colors are giving you the sensitivity of the Fermi-Lat telescope. Here you see OC, at the very high energies you see LASO. So depending on the gamma ray energies you are interested in, this plot can help you to decide which data you should use. The outline of the talk today is the following. I will spend the first 10 slides, more or less, to introduce the topic and to give you some ingredients that will be really useful to understand what we're going to do next. Then I will spend some time analyzing the prototype of those objects, that is the Geminga gamma ray halo. And then if I will have time, I will cover those three aspects. First of all, if gamma ray halos are generic properties of all pulsars or not, what is our current understanding? I will connect then the gamma rays to the positron excess, and I will spend a few words on the current understanding on how those gamma ray halos are formed around cosmic ray accelerators. So my goal is that to take home the observational status, what we can learn with this kind of objects and what we understood so far. Of course, I will focus on my work that in this topic is collected in this publication that I list here, and I thank at this point my collaborators with which I used the past few years to understand the physics of those objects, in particular Mattia Di Mauro and Fiorenza Donato, now at the University of Turin, but also recently we started to collaborate with cosmic ray acceleration and propagation experts, such as, for example, Sara Recchia, Felix Aronian, and Stefano Gabici, and we also have in our group recently a new PhD student that is Luca Orusa. So let's start. What is the engine of the emission that we saw in the picture before? We believe mostly because we have a positional coincidence of a pulsar, but also because we can actually explain, as I will see in a moment, we believe that the engine are pulsars. Those are galactic objects that are believed to be fast rotating magnetized neutron stars, originated by the collapse of very massive stars. And the process with which particles are created and accelerated can be summarized as follows. So we know that pulsars have very high magnetic fields. In those high magnetic fields, a wind of particles can be extracted from the surface of the neutron star. And we will mostly consider in all this talk that only leptons have been extracted. So electrons and positrons pairs are then produced in the cascades. I will just comment about possible hadronic acceleration at the very end. After a few kilo years in the evolution of the systems, we then believe that the pairs that have been produced and then accelerated in the termination shocks of this system in the interstellar medium can be released in the outside of the pulsar wind nebula, and they can propagate towards also our detectors. In these processes, those objects shine from radio to gamma rays thanks to different processes. And in particular, the engine, we believe, is the pulsar spin-down energy. So this is the energy that then is translated to the energies of electrons and positron pairs. And if you want to compute what is the efficiency, you can then really compare the pulsar spin-down energy to the energy of the electrons or of the gamma rays, depending on what you are looking at. In this process, you need also to assume a spectral index for the distribution of accelerated particle, and you need to also assume some luminosity function for the time evolution that we typically take as the pulsar luminosity function. So from these equations, you should remember the efficiency and the spectral index that is really ruling what is the relationship between those two quantities. Then now we have very high energy particles, but how they produce gamma rays. We believe that the process at end in gamma ray halos is inverse Compton scattering. In particular, those electrons and positrons are upscattering the low photons of the ambient radiation, for example, the photons of the cosmic microwave background, but also the UV and infrared backgrounds. And since we are talking about emission that is extending, as we will see in a moment, up to a few tens of parsecs around the pulsar, we can safely assume that the interstellar radiation fields are the ones that we need to consider in order to compute the inverse Compton scattering. If you want to compute what is the expectation for this emission, you need a prediction for the distribution of the number density of your high energy particles. Then you multiply this by the inverse Compton power, and then you integrate along the line of sight towards your source in a specific region of the sky, and you integrate across the electron energy. And in this way, you can obtain a prediction for your flux of gamma rays by inverse Compton. In this plot, what I wanted to mention is that whenever you are looking to specific gamma rays that are coming from inverse Compton scattering, you can map quite easily the energy of the gamma rays to the energies of the parent electrons and positron populations. And here the color map is just saying how the inverse Compton powers relate with respect to the maximum of the function that we use here. So you will have, of course, a distribution of particles that will give you a specific energy in gamma rays, and you can relate this to the maximum of the inverse Compton power. And for example, if you are looking to 1 TeV gamma rays. In inverse Compton, this means that you are looking in the peak of the distribution at 10 TeV electrons, but you have also much higher energies and a little bit more smaller energy. So really looking to different energies in gamma rays is permitting you to test different cosmic ray electrons and positrons population. So now in this phenomenology of the creation, acceleration, and expansion of this object into the interstellar medium, we expect and we actually detect gamma rays from pulsars at different phases. And I really want to do this, this distinction because then we need to focus on only the last stage that you see in this list. So we see a gamma rays from the pulsar. So this is the pulsed emission from the pulsar magnetosphere. And here you see, for example, a collection of the pulsations, so the flux of gamma rays and other wavelengths as a function of time. And you see that the majority of the pulsars in our galaxy are really very well detected into gamma rays. In here you see, for example, Geminga, that was actually discovered as a pulsar only in gamma rays. If you go then at larger angular scales, a few parsecs around the pulsar, you find what we call the pulsar ring nebula that we believe is dominated by the shock physics. And those objects are detected mainly to be young objects when the pulsar age is less than 10 kiloyears. And we believe that we are looking to particles that are confined in the region around the shocks that are created when this bubble of electrons and positrons is expanding into the interstellar medium. Here you see a collection of the multi-wavelength measurement of the prototype of a pulsar ring nebula in our galaxy, that is the Crab Nebula. And by looking to the list of your talks in your nice program of seminars, I realized that a few weeks ago, you learned probably a lot about the pulsar ring nebula. So now you should take in mind what you learned last time and think that we are looking to much larger regions around those objects. So we are talking about tens of parsecs around the central parsec. So I'm not going to explain mostly pulsar ring nebula, but what you see at much larger scales. So once we have produced those particles, we accelerated them, we believe they have been released from the accelerator, we need to transport them across the interstellar medium. And at the energies we are interested in, the main processes that we believe are at play are diffusion and energy losses. So the diffusion is mostly assumed to be isotropic, but I will comment at the very end that actually we should question this particular point of our assumptions. And then the other very important process are energy losses, in particular by synchrotron emission and inverse Compton, as I told you before. In the process of explaining the propagation and the transport of electrons and positrons around the sources, I will take mostly the diffusion coefficient that is ruling really the propagation of those particles as a free parameter in order to see if I obtain or not a similar value with respect to what I obtain when propagating the other species of cosmic rays in our galaxy. And this is exactly the same picture that we use also to propagate particles across all the galaxy and also to predict what is the flux of electrons and positrons, for example, from one specific source. And since I'm dealing with single sources that are mostly nearby in our galaxy, I will use the infinite halo approximation in what follows. So I will not care about the boundaries in which we believe the diffusion of cosmic rays in our galaxy is then confined. One important aspect when talking about sources of electrons and positrons in our galaxy is to remember that the energy loss timescales for this particle is smaller than the diffusion one. This means that if I look to the propagation horizon, so at which distance at most I can expect to see particles of a given energy, I end up with the following picture. Here you see a scheme of our galaxy. The dots here are the position of pulsars in a specific simulation in which also spiral arms have been included. We are sitting at the center, and the different contours here are giving to you what is the propagation of horizon for a positron of different energies. So you see that, for example, at 1 TeV, our horizon to see possible sources of positrons is confined to be 1 or 2 kiloparsecs. Of course, this is a statement that is depending on the propagation parameters that you use, but what we obtain with the parameters that are now compatible with the cosmic ray analysis is mostly compatible with the picture that I'm looking to. Here is also important to state then how much is important to model carefully the local sources of cosmic rays, because we believe that they really dominate the positron fluxes that we are seeing. And why this is important? Because in the last 10 years, we have been trying to explain what we call the positron excess. This is an excess with respect to the standard expectations of the propagation of cosmic rays, in which we expect that antimatter particles in cosmic rays, and in particular positrons, are just produced by the spallation of hadronic cosmic rays of primaries in the interstellar medium. While first the Pamela experiment, and then lastly, the AMS with very high accuracy confirmed us that instead the positron flux is rising at energies larger than 10 GeV, and then is starting to decrease, although the errors in the TeV energy range are really important at the moment. So in order to explain the bulk of the positron excess, we need a new primary source that is probably also nearby for the argument that I said to you before. So now I will go to discuss what is the prototype of a galactic gamma ray halo, that is the Geminga halo, that I would say that is recognized as a gamma ray halo by the majority of the community at the moment. And for this source, what I told you before for the structure pulsar, pulsar with nebula, and pulsar halo is in particular true. In fact, this source was discovered to be a pulsar just in the gamma rays. In fact, it was the first radio quiet pulsar discovered, is pretty nearby, is sitting at 250 parsec, and is also pretty old. We believe that is 340 kilo years old. We see structures around the pulsar that we call the pulsar with nebula, both in radio and in X-ray. And in particular, I find amazing the image that we have in X-ray with the Chandra telescope, in which we really see what we call the bow shock of the pulsar with nebula. And we recognize that the pulsar is actually traveling with a very large kick velocity in the interstellar medium. And as you can see, this has an important consequences for shaping the morphology of the X-ray pulsar with nebula, but we will see that this will also have some consequences for the GeV energies that we will look in the gamma ray halo. So, so far before the observation of the HAWC experiment, a few degree TeV emission around this object was never detected. And now we go back to the image that we started with, the observation of the HAWC detector of this region in the sky. So the HAWC observatory is detecting a few degree extended gamma ray emission at energy larger than 5 TeV. And this is consistent with something that was also pointed out before by the Milagro experiment. And the agreement in the community now is that those structures that extend way more far away with respect to the pulsar with nebula are coming from electrons and positrons that has been accelerated from the pulsar and pulsar with nebula system, and now are released into the interstellar medium, and they are propagating into the interstellar medium. And since now you know that we need nearby sources to explain the positron excess, this was seen as an incredible demonstration that those sources can indeed be among the main candidates to explain the positron excess. So what we can learn from the HAWC discovery? First of all, we can estimate what is the efficiency of conversion of the pulsar spin-down energy in high-energy electrons and positron pairs, because now we can measure what is actually the inverse Compton scattering flux that those particles produce. So if we assume that the Geminga and Monogem observed gamma ray luminosity, I just forgot to say that apart from Geminga, also the Monogem source has been discovered, but we will talk about the other candidates later on. So just forget about Monogem here, just consider Geminga. And we measure the gamma ray luminosity. We know that, and we assume that those gamma rays are produced by relativistic electrons and positrons, so we can infer finally the conversion efficiency of this mechanism. And the HAWC collaboration in the first paper claimed that they were seeing an efficiency of around 40% for the Geminga object. Now changing the different assumptions, so for example, the spectral index, we agree, I would say in the literature that we need an efficiency that is at most of 10 to 20%, so around tens of percent. So a significant part of the pulsar spin-door energy needs to be translated into the electrons and positron pairs that then are emitting the gamma rays that we are seeing. The second lesson that we learned from the OC discovery is about the diffusion in the vicinity of the pulsar that appears to be suppressed. And for the rest of the talk until the very end, I will work under this assumption. And how we can understand this, we can look to the emission intensity profile of the source that is also called sometimes surface brightness. So here is the flux as a function of the distance from the pulsar. Here you see the distance in degree, and computing with the distance of the source, we have the distance from the pulsar in parsecs. So this is the argument I was taking before to say to you that this emission is extending up to 20 parsecs around the central pulsar. So you can try to model this decreasing surface brightness. And if you use the model in which the diffusion coefficient is a free parameter, you end up saying that you need a diffusion parameter that is smaller, 500 times roughly, with respect to the average value that we can measure with the other cosmic rays that we measure. So this has been recognized and considered so far as an evidence for an homogeneous diffusion in the galaxy. And again, remember that I will work through all the talk until the very end under this assumption, that this is really the evidence that there are different regions in our galaxy, and in particular around the sources, the propagation properties and the transport properties are different. Now let's try to open our eyes also to other gamma ray energies. So we see this at the TeV. What about the GeV and the multi-TeV energy range? If you have control of the theoretical model in which you can really compute, as I told you before, what is the extension as a function of the energy just by computing the seed of particles and then computing the gamma rays by inverse Compton, you can collect information on this plot in which you see the extension in degrees as a function of the energy. And the different lines here are obtained with a transport model in which we change the diffusion coefficient. The black line is what is reproduced in the observation by OC, and the other lines are for smaller or larger diffusion coefficient. And here you can see, first of all, that if you raise the diffusion coefficient up to values that are similar to the value of the interstellar medium, you end up producing a gamma ray halo of Geminga that is much more spread in the interstellar medium, even at TeV energies. So you will not expect to see it actually with the OC detector. While another important consequence of this plot is that if we want to look something at smaller energies, the extension is predicted to increase quite a lot. So we need to consider this if we want to search for a counterpart of the Geminga halo also at the GeV energy ranges. Another important aspect that you need to consider if you want to search for a counterpart of this gamma ray halo in the GeV energy range is the proper motion. In fact, this source with this measured kick velocity has traveled around 70 parsec across its age. So the cometary structure that we see in X-rays actually is reflected also for the GeV gamma rays that are produced by electrons and positrons that has been accelerated and released when the pulsar was traveling in a different region in the sky. So if you again predict what will be the distortion of the morphology of the source, you end up saying that actually the distortion should be relevant until 30 to 50 GeV. So you need to consider that in order to produce your templates to search for this emission. And those were the ingredients that we considered when we started to search for a counterpart of the Geminga gamma ray halo in Fermilab. And here you see some of the details of our analysis. One important point, apart from the ones that you already said, is that we are including automatically in our template fitting the energy dependence of the spatial morphology, because we are not searching for a Gaussian or a disk-like distribution of photons, but we are really searching for a diffusive-like template. So we computed the template as a function of energy, and you see here also the distortion if you include the proper motion with respect to the case in which you don't include proper motion. So in particular, in this case, if you look for a signal without including proper motion, you are searching for the peak in a region in which actually the peak is not there. So we computed this analysis and we find a significant emission from the Geminga halo also at the Fermi-Lat energy. And we confirm also in this case that a diffusion that is similar to the one that is measured by Ock can explain the signal that we are looking at. At this time, the size of the extension of this object is larger. So at 100 GeV, we computed that is around 60 parsec. And the efficiency of conversion is again confirmed to be around 10 to 20%. Another interesting thing is that if we repeat the fit with or without the proper motion effect, we actually find that the model with the proper motion is preferred at least for sigma. So we are kind of detecting the proper motion also with GeV gamma rays, even if we know already and we put as an input in our templates the particular direction and the value of the velocity. Now we can complement the spectral energy distribution of this halo with also the Fermi-Lat observations here and the Fermi-Lat upper limits. So here you see the Ock measurement, and here you see what we were able to put with the Fermi-Lat analysis. As I told you, the Geminga halo in this image of the gamma rays was not the only one, a source that was discovered by Ock. In that particular paper, the monogem halo was a little bit dimmer, and in fact, we don't find a significant value for the emission from the monogem halo, and we just put upper limit in this case. What about the larger energies now for the Geminga halo? As I told you, looking to different energies is crucial to constrain the different population of particles, but also the propagation. And so far, this is, to my knowledge, the situation for the detection of a counterpart of the Geminga halo in the S and LASO experiments. Those are both preliminary results that were presented at the ICRC this summer. So the S detector is finding a preliminary positive signal around 50 GeV and 50 TeV. So this is really bridging the Fermi-Lat measurement and the Ock experiment. And the emission is found to be likely larger than 3 GeV. And what I find also interesting in that it seems that it's also asymmetric. So it might be that also they are seeing some signal of the asymmetry of the proper motion effect, but at this point this is just speculation because they are not even claiming a statistical evidence for this asymmetric emission. If we then look to very larger energies, LASO detector also presented some preliminary discovery for the Geminga and monogem halo. You see here the significance map, and they claim that they see the halos also at much larger energies of 25 to 63 TeV. So this is just obtained, if I remember correctly, after 1 year of observation of the LASO detector, and we really look forward for the complete statistics. At this point, I wanted to make a break, so I'm happy to take some questions if there are.
So you can just unmute yourself, Marcus, please.
Yeah, I have a question about the relation between the positron excess and Geminga and monogem. Can we learn something from this TeV halos about the origin of this positron excess as well?
Yes, I'm going to comment about it at the later point, but yeah. Of course the answer is yes. For the moment, you need to be careful and specify what are your assumptions for the propagation. So we will see that depending on the assumptions of the propagation, you can or not explain the positron excess. Okay, but I will come to that at a later point.
And maybe another quick question. So did I understand you correctly that you use the motion of Geminga for your fitting, or was this like a free parameter that you also constrained with this fitting?
No, exactly. So we use the observation of the X-rays in order to build our template. So the velocity is not a free parameter. We are just building a template in which the proper motion effect is taken into account and a template in which is not taken into account. And we find a preference when fitting the Fermi-Lat data for the model with the proper motion effect.
I see.
So this is
compared to no motion.
Exactly. And you can see here the reason. So if we are really seeing the Geminga gamma ray halo and the proper Moshev value is correct, you should search for the peak in the right position. And here you see that there is a significant shift with respect to the peak.
Okay, thank you.
And yes, I hope that I will cover your question about the positron excess. If not, we can go back to that later on.
Thank you.
And Enrico?
Hi, yes, just a curiosity. You were showing slide 18 or for whatever other pulsar wind or pulsar system that we can have a multi-TV and recently from CRAB also PV gamma rays. I was wondering, in this, is relevant the inverse Compton emission on optical UV and infrared, or is dominated by the CMB, so we would have PV electrons?
I'm going to comment a little bit about the OC pevatrons later on. What I can say is that going to higher and higher energies, the CMB is the most important photon fields. In our specific model, by the way, we are considering all the spectrum of the photon fields. So we are considering both the contribution from UV and also infrared. So it's just a sum of the different contributions, I would say. And depending on the energies that you're looking at, the other fields are starting to give an important contribution. But for example, if you look to the OC collaboration paper, what they were doing, they were basically considered only the CMB. And this is a good approximation already at those energies.
I see, thank you.
I probably don't have the spectrum of the interstellar radiation field in those slides, but we can go back to that after if there are still some points that are not clear.
So just Sylvia, so yeah, Johan is asking a question.
Yeah.
No, so you just said that for the higher energy electrons, the most important background for the photon is the CMB. Mm-hmm. But I mean, as we've seen, like the emission come from like a smaller angular region. So I would expect, like, actually for maybe it's also important to take into account the stellar emission or the emission around the pulsar, which come from other sources than CMB.
Yeah. So this is an important point, in my opinion, if you want to compute the multi-wavelength spectral energy distribution for pulsar wind nebula. But at the distances of 20 parsec around Geminga, we don't have any evidence that we should consider a different interstellar radiation field. So I will work under the assumption that is correct to use the mean interstellar radiation field of all the galaxy. Of course, this is an approximation and might be even not correct, but we don't have any evidence that we should instead take a different density for the photon fields there.
Okay, thank you very much. And so if I can also, so a small question again on slide 17. So these are your templates, huh? These are not the observation.
Those are the templates.
Okay, just to be sure.
Yes, so in the Fermi-Lat energy range, you will never be able to see like the signal.
Yes,
no, this is just definitely the template. Here we tried to do the counts map, the template, and then the residuals, but the evidence for the detection is really a collective evidence in all the
yeah.
You don't really have the excess emission as you have, for example, for the TV gamma rays. So you don't have pi sigma in a specific pixel. This is not true at the moment.
No, very good.
Yeah, thanks for this clarification.
No worries, no. And maybe last small question about the efficiency. So is there a way to constrain, another way to constrain the efficiency? Because so right now you're saying that so the spin, so basically the efficiency is 10%, but all the other energy, where does it go? I mean, is it possible to constrain these other energy losses?
Yes, so this is also a very good point. What I'm doing here is integration in all the energy range of the spectral energy distribution, right? So I'm assuming that the pulsar is emitting electrons and positrons from 0.1 GeV, 1 GeV up to very high energies. And as you are noting, in fact, this efficiency value is strongly dependent on the spectral index that you put in this distribution. So depending on how you distribute your electrons in your spectrum, you will end up with different values. So this is the reason why we want also to constrain the spectral energy distribution, because in this way we can have a much closer look to the efficiency values with less uncertainties.
Okay, I see. And but the rest of the energy, where does it go if not injected in electrons positron?
Yeah, this is an interesting point. So in general, depending on who you talk to, is a problem to have a small efficiency or is a problem to have a large efficiency. So
Okay.
you can think about other acceleration mechanism. For example, a part of the pulsar spin-down energy could also go to hadrons, and this is something that I will comment at the end. Or you can even say that not all the pulsar, so you will have pairs at different stages, but probably just a part of those pairs are then accelerated to very high energy. So then this efficiency is effective.
This is what I would expect. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. So of course here, if you obtain 100%, this is really your upper limit in any case, because this will be 100% conversion and 100% acceleration. And probably the situation in reality is not like that. But at this stage, we can just have those phenomenological parameters to think.
So there is no way to assess the amount of energy which is injected in the wind, maybe in the electron of the wind, and not in the accelerated electrons yet. Maybe.
If you consider only gamma rays in a specific energy range, you can always compute what is the efficiency in that specific energy range. And this is what, for example, people in the X-ray community always do. So they compute what is the efficiency of conversion of the energetic, for example, the person spin down into photons in that specific energy range. And this is also another way of computing this. With an eye to the positron excess, and since we want to really compute also electrons and positrons in a wide range of energies, we typically use this integral in which we are integrating the spectral energy distribution in all the regions.
I see. Very good.
Yeah. But as you will see also in a moment, it's important which region of gamma rays you are looking at to constrain different particle seeds and particle energies, of course.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much.
Great.
All right. I see now the hands of Silvia. Continue.
Okay, I can continue. Great. I'm happy about the questions. So this means that a couple of passages I'll try. So the first question I'm going to raise here is, now we discussed about the Geminga gamma ray halo. I told you something about the monogem gamma ray halo, but mostly about the Geminga halo. So are those halos a generic properties of all the pulsars, or we are just looking to specific objects that create these strange structures in the sky? And for this, an important question that you should ask to yourself is if you will be able to detect those structures in the sky or not. So for example, for Fermilab, as we have seen, it's really challenging to detect something that is extended much more than 10 degrees in the sky, while for the very high energy experiments, we have a few degrees instantaneous field of view. So again, something that is more extended. So for example, the S detection of the Geminga halo is much complicated because of this effect, because the emission is probably much more extended at 3 to 4 degrees. So in order to understand this point, what we did was to produce these plots in which you have, for a generic distance and age of a pulsar, what is the extension that you will expect. So this angle that is containing the 68% of the photons, for different values of the energy and also of the diffusion properties. And the ATNF pulsars, so the pulsars in current catalogs, are also inserted in this plot. And focusing on the TV energy range here, you see that if the diffusion properties are similar around all other pulsars and all create those pulsar halo, actually most of the pulsars in the catalogs will produce halos that are detectable and are a good target for the inverse Compton gamma ray halo. Situation is a little bit more complicated at lower energies because you will need to look to farther away sources or very old objects in order to have extension that is less than, for example, 2 degrees. So now what we asked ourselves is the following. Since it seems that the majority of the A10F pulsars actually can create a pulsar halo, are the detections in current catalogs compatible with being a pulsar halo? So the moment in the catalogs, for example, of S and OC, sources that are in coincidence with pulsars are called the pulsar nebula or maybe supernova remnant candidates. But what we wanted to test is if the transport properties of the particles around the sources were compatible with a description that is similar to the one that we used for the Geminga halo. So first of all, what we did was to take the pulsars in the catalog and to rank them according to the gamma ray flux that you predict for those objects at 10 TeV. And we realized that in this ranking, the majority of the sources were already detected by OC and S, and this was already a good sign that this mechanism is probably explaining what we are actually seeing in the catalog. And then we looked to the maps that were released by the S collaboration that were obtained by looking to different sources, in particular in the galactic plane. And we extracted from this catalog the surface brightness. So again, the flux of gamma rays as a function of the distance from the central source. And here you see an example for one particular source in which you see that actually a diffusion model is way more consistent with the observation with respect to a Gaussian distribution of photons. And under the assumption that the emission is purely leptonic, we then feed the surface brightness with a free diffusion coefficient. And what we obtain is the following. So again, under the assumption that the transport properties around the sources are the same as the one of the Geminga monogem, with a free diffusion coefficient parameter, we obtain that for all the sources in our sample, we find a significant suppression of this diffusion coefficient with respect to the mean value in the galaxy. In this plot, you see the value of the fitted diffusion coefficient as a function of h, and we don't see a significant trend as a function of h. And here you see the equivalent size of the gamma ray pulsar halo. And also here we are able to find, even if there is a lot of scatter, I would say that those halos have a typical size of 30 parsec, are above 1 TeV. So again, if this description is correct, this means that we are saying that the extension of those objects is much more broad with respect to the extension of the pulsar wind nebula systems in which we see, for example, X-ray and radio emissions. Here is the point in which I wanted to comment about the highest gamma ray sky, and in particular about the sources that have been detected by OC at energy larger than 56 and 100 TeV. Here you see the significance map now of this measurement by the OC collaboration, and here you see the spectral energy distribution of the 3 sources that were detected as significant up to more than 100 TeV. And I realized that just today there was a paper by Lazo adding other points for the Crab Nebula just here at the very high energies. Typically, this measurement was searched for a long time as a smoking gun for a possible hadronic emission, but actually, as we will see in a moment, we realized that those sources could be explained with leptonic emission as well. And again, here we played the same game we did for the Geminga halo, and we searched for counterparts of those very high energy extended emissions seen by OC in the Fermi-Lat detector. And here I want to be pretty fast. The answer is that we found a significant emission of 2 sources out of 3. The problem here is that we are looking to much younger objects. So here, probably the assumption that the diffusion around the sources is isotropized, and we can really use a diffusion loss equation, and we are not anymore under the influence of the pulsar wind nebula is probably less reasonable. So we will need to study more those objects, probably one by one. But globally, what we can say is that a model similar to the one that is able to reproduce the Geminga halos is also able to reproduce the multi-wavelength spectrum of those 3 objects. And here you see just an independent analysis that took our Fermi-Lat measurements and also end up with similar conclusions for the explanation of the spectrum with mainly leptonic emission. Just to have a recap now for the current candidates. So Geminga so far was detected mainly by all the detectors that we had in our family before. The blue ones here are the tentative detections that are still preliminary by the different observatories, and then the orange ones are the ones that are probably debated, so we probably need to understand more carefully what is going on in each specific source. Here I wanted to report also a new observation of the laser detector of a pulsar halo that is not having a counterpart of a pulsar wind nebula. So here we just see a pulsar at the very center, and we don't have any pulsar wind nebula at the X-ray or radio emission. And this is a demonstration of what was pointed out at the very beginning when the OC reported the detection of the gamma ray halos, that actually those halos might be a possible tool to discover new pulsars, because if the beam of the pulsar is not pointing in your direction, but you still have the halo, you will probably be able to recognize this morphology and then to identify new pulsars, for example. What are the detection prospects for this? We expect a pulsar halo sky, so our catalogs with a majority of the sources at the very high energies to be pulsar halo. The short answer is that this will really depend on the properties of the galactic pulsar population. For example, here you see the cumulative number of sources that you would expect to detect as a function of the age, and you see that depending on the distribution of the pulsar properties is here, for example, the pulsar spin down, you will expect or not to exceed even the counts in the current catalogs. And as well, this is also a thing that is depending on the efficiency of conversion of your pulsar wind into electrons and positron pairs that are then emitting gamma rays. Of course, then it's also depending on where you put the division line between the systems that we in the past called pulsar wind nebula and the systems that now I'm calling halo. Now we go to the positron excess. If we trust the observations that we saw before, we need to take into account about this two-zone diffusion. So the fact that around the source we have a slow diffusion, a suppressed diffusion, but in the rest of the galaxy we don't have any evidence for the same values. So what those colleagues did was to introduce a two-zone diffusion model in which you are able to produce a semi-analytical solution in which you take into account both diffusion zones with a radius of the first zone that can vary. And if you do this and you try to compute what is the positron flux that is compatible, in particular in this case for Geminga, to the gamma ray observations, you end up saying what I was trying to mention before. Because of the inverse Compton emission mechanism, if you are looking to gamma rays at the TeV energy scale, and we use those observations to predict what we see in the positron flux at much lower energies, we are doing a very large extrapolation. The energy range in which we instead are able to constrain the same electrons that are then producing probably the positron excess is the Fermi-Lat energy range. And here you see what is this combination of different effects. So here you see the spectral energy distribution we were looking at before. And for two different spectral energy distributions, so with two different values of the spectral index, you are compatible with the OC measurements, but you end up with very different predictions in the Fermi-Lat energy range and also in the range in which we see the positron excess. So you see that just looking to the OC data, the Geminga contribution is not constrained. And this is the reason why we wanted to look for gamma rays from the Geminga halo. So now, using the measurement that I showed to you before, we were able to constrain the spectral energy distribution of those particles and to produce a much more concrete prediction for the particles that are in the energy range of the positron excess. And here is the result. So you see that we concluded that the Geminga pulsar can contribute even to 100% depending on the uncertainties that you consider in the spectral energy distribution or in the diffusion in the rest of the galaxy, can really account for a significant part of the positron excess at the highest energies. And I would say also that this is a wonderful example of a multi-way messenger analysis, because we are really using gamma rays to constrain cosmic ray sources. And I think this is super interesting, at least for me, that I started my work in research just doing cosmic rays analysis and then having those parameters free. And then now we can start to constrain a little bit, a couple of them. And here I see also some other independent analysis that reached similar conclusions. Another question that we at some point asked to ourselves at that point, so this was 1 year ago already, is what if all the pulsars in our galaxy have a similar halo around them of suppressed diffusion? We saw that Geminga maybe is not enough to explain all the positron excess, but we have plenty of pulsars in our galaxy. So typically in standard diffusion analysis, what we end up concluding is that the collective contribution of pulsars could be a possible solution for the positron excess. And my group did that, also the group of Jan in the past did a very nice analysis demonstrating this. So this is something that we know already. Now, what if the diffusion properties around the source are different? And the short answer is that even in this option, you will be able to explain the positron excess with the cumulative distribution. But if you consider only the pulsars that you have in the catalog, but also if you simulate galactic pulsars with Monte Carlos in spiral arms. So if we really take into account also the 2D distribution of the position of the pulsars in our galaxy. I don't know how much time I have left.
About 10 minutes.
Okay, great. So I think that we have time, if you are not too tired, to discuss the last part of my talk, and then I'm happy to take questions at the end. So far, what I try to convince you is that we are demonstrating that the suppression around the source is real. So we are modeling phenomenologically this suppression around the sources with the smallest diffusion coefficient with respect to the rest of our galaxy. But is this really reasonable? And most importantly, where you put the division line between the pulsar wind and the halo? In this particular plot and scheme that looks very complicated, but was produced to pass this message that probably the sources that we are looking at around 10 to 100 kiloyears are in a transitorial regime between being a pulsar wind nebula, so being still under the influence of the shock system of the supernova remnant and the pulsar wind nebula, and then the region in which instead we expect that the propagation is just dominated by the properties of the interstellar medium. And you can end up by defining those objects based on the transport properties, or on the energy density, or on the age. My point here is that probably the most important thing is to be able to explain the morphology and the energy distribution of those objects. And then afterwards, once we will have a population of objects, try to understand where to put the division line. So before having more than 2 or 3 objects, I will say that it's very, very difficult to understand exactly the evolution of those systems, because so far the community concentrated a lot on simulating what is happening at small scales around the pulsars and in the pulsar wind nebula shocks. But now we need to extend our simulations up to very longest time, so up to 100, 200, even 300 kiloyears after the formation of the pulsar. And this is really challenging. And I would say that this is really what we need in order to have a comprehensive model and not just a phenomenological model as the one I'm using so far in this plot, in this talk. But now what I'm going to turn is the assumption of the pure isotropic diffusion. In fact, this was a pillar of what I was doing so far. And this is also the most widely used assumption, both by the OC collaboration, by my collaborators, and also by other groups, such as, for example, the group of Tim Linden and others. And this is true, but if you consider that you have a local bubble of suppressed diffusion, so this coefficient is not true only for the regions around the source, but it's also true in much more extended regions of our galaxy. But this was then recognized to be unlikely if you start to see candidates of pulsar halo at much larger distances, because then you will end up saying that all your galaxy has a suppressed diffusion, and this is not compatible with the other cosmic ray fluxes that we observe. And our solution for that before was to use a two-zone diffusion. So to assume that we have those two regimes in which the diffusion coefficient around the pulsar is smaller with respect to the one of the rest of our galaxy. And in this assumption, you end up with a question, how you create those suppressed diffusion zones. What is really the mechanism that is able to create those zones in our galaxy and around the sources? And so far, the most reasonably accepted theory is the one of cosmic ray self-confinement that I will discuss in a moment. But what we started to question is really the assumption of the isotropic diffusion at first stage, because we didn't understood yet if this is really needed or even correct. Some collaborators try to use anisotropic diffusion just to think that there are magnetic fields that must be pointing along the line side, and this is the reason why we see, for example, for the case of the Geminga halo, such as small regions in the sky in which we have the gamma rays emitting from the cosmic rays. But again, this is also unlikely if many candidates are detected, because this will mean that we will have the magnetic field aligned in the direction of all the sources that we are detecting. What we realized by confronting ourselves with other cosmic rays experts, and in particular experts of the cosmic ray microphysics, is that in the case in which we consider a transition between the ballistic and a diffusive regime, the suppression of the diffusion might not even be needed. And this is what I'm discussing in the last few slides, because this was recognized a long time ago for other systems that the transport of cosmic rays, and in particular case also for electrons and positrons, cannot be considered diffusive at any time. In particular, if you introduce a quantity that is called the scattering time, that is the time scale for the isotropization of the particle direction, you will have an initial stage in which the propagation of particles is ballistic, a transition between a ballistic and a diffusive regime, and then after multiple deflection in the turbulence magnetic field, you will have an isotropization of the particle direction, and in that specific regime, you can assume to have isotropic diffusion. And if you compute those values for typical parameters in our galaxy, you end up saying that the typical propagation scale at 10 TeV for this phenomenon, for this transition, is actually 10 parsecs. So it's not negligible with respect to the extension at which we see, for example, the Geminga gamma ray halo. And in fact, what you should do instead, according to the model that we recently presented, is to take a model that is considering both regimes and then putting them together. And this is what you will end up in the distribution of your electrons as a function of the distance from the center of the source. You will have the smaller distances that are dominated by the ballistic diffusion, and then at larger distances, around 10 parsec, you will have the diffusive regime starting to enter. And this is something that, if it's not taken into account, has been demonstrated in the past, that can lead to the superluminant propagation problem. And the question is, but with this model, you can fit still the gamma ray morphology, and the answer is yes. You see here the three recognized gamma ray halos, I would say, so Geminga, Monogem, and the LASO source. And in blue, you see the fit with this transition between the ballistic and diffusion propagation, and in orange, you see only the diffusion. So at the moment, the data that we have are not enough to disentangle between the two models. But one important point is that in the case of the transition between the ballistic and diffusive propagation, this morphology is computed with diffusion parameters that are the same as the one that we use for the rest of our galaxy. So in this case, we don't need to rely on the assumption that the diffusion is suppressed. The other theory that is that instead those diffusion zones are real and the diffusion is really suppressed, are relying on the concept of cosmic ray self-confinement. And the mechanism is the following. You have a cosmic ray gradient, as we see, produced by the pulsar. And this is inducing a streaming instability that is self-confined in the cosmic ray population. And this is also a mechanism that has been considered for supernova remnants as well. And this was presented a few years ago by Evole and collaborators, in which they demonstrated that they were able to suppress the diffusion coefficient for a very small time after the creation of the pulsar, but then afterwards, there was a relaxation time. So in particular, the Geminga source that will stand here will not be explained. A paper that was put out a few days ago in the archive actually claims that in this paper there was an error, so a typo in one of the parameters, and in particular in the damping term. And if they compute again in this context, what will be the suppression of the diffusion coefficient, you end up actually being able to suppress the diffusion up to very large times after the creation of the pulsar. And this is for sure true in 1D scenarios. In 3D, unfortunately, they are still not able to explain the suppression with only the self-confinement effect of the electrons. You will need also the parent supernova to be at play there and add also density of cosmic rays. So far, I would say that this part of the interpretation is one of the most debated. Let me conclude with some perspectives. So far, I've been assuming that pulsars create and accelerate only leptons, but has been demonstrated that those systems actually can extract and accelerate also hadrons. You see, for example, here that at very large scales also a luminosity of accelerated protons is predicted. So I think that this is something that we should investigate more carefully, and probably similarly to what the IceCube collaboration did in the direction of the pulsar nebula, we should also search for neutrino signals from the candidate pulsar halo, and to see if in this way we can constrain hadronic emission. And as I told you many times during this talk, I think that the most clear message of those analyses is that we really need to understand better the acceleration and release of cosmic rays from the sources. And for this, we really need the theoretical advances. So probably we need to build up simulations that are able to reconstruct all the history of the formation of the pulsars and the pulsar nebula down to the halo. And of course, the usual argument of the multi-wavelength analysis is true also here. We should go also to radio and X-rays, because, for example, if protons are there, we don't expect radio emission. But also the LASO and CTA detectors are a huge step forward for us, because we are going to understand if really we have a population of sources or not. And this will be great to constrain and determine the transport properties around the sources. So finally, my take-home messages from the point of view of the observational situation, I would say that we don't have only Geminga as a gamma ray halo, but probably those halos are emerging as a new source class in the gamma ray sky. What we are learning is about the acceleration and the transport properties of cosmic rays around their sources. And what we understood so far, even if I reported to you many different analyses, I would say that for sure, pulsars are compatible with leptonic accelerations, and we have a huge smoking gun for the presence of electrons and positrons that are escaping the accelerators and are probably the explanation for the positron excess. And what we will hopefully understand in the future, it will be the diffusion line between the different evolutionary stages of those objects, and really what are the transport mechanisms at play to explain their morphology as a function of the energy. Thanks a lot. I'm done, and I'm happy to discuss with you other questions.
Thank you very much, Silvia. This was a really good overview of all the stuff concerning TeV halos. And maybe we have time for a couple of questions. We already had a few, so maybe I'll start. If you go to your slide 34, I think it's 34. 3.4.
Ah, 3.4, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, I was wondering, you're trying to make a distinction between diffusive propagation only and diffusive plus ballistic. And my guess is that this depends quite strongly in the morphology of the magnetic field and the distinction between only diffusive and diffusive plus ballistic. And so my question is, these error bars that you see here between the orange and the blue curves, are these accounting for those magnetic field fudge factors?
No, okay, so the error bars, so these 68 bands that you see are just the 68% bands for the fit to the data. So those are not uncertainties in the modeling. In the paper, we have also different assumptions for the theoretical modeling. What we are not doing, but my collaborators probably plan to do in the future, is also to consider different morphologies and different setups for the flux tubes of the particles that are propagating. So at the moment, we are spreading those particles in any case in all the solid angle. But as you are saying correctly, in the ballistic propagation, you will probably need to consider the specific morphology of your magnetic field to propagate the sources. And this will have the effect to suppress again your efficiency, because at the moment we are just assuming that particles propagate ballistically, but at 4 pi.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And I think Enrico has a question, and Joan.
Yes. Hi. First of all, very nice talk. And second, I have just two curiosity. So mostly I'm asking you to elaborate a bit more. So first of all, in the model you developed with Sarah, the instability you are speaking about are the non-resonant one.
So we are not computing the cosmic ray cell confinement, but you are probably asking me to comment about this.
No, well, this one is the works of Tim Linden. I'm kind of aware about them.
Okay.
Mostly considering this kind of model, which kind of instability you are involved.
We don't need to really model any instability, I would say, in this case. It's just that the particles are not yet isotropized. So you cannot use the assumption of isotropic diffusion.
Okay.
This is the key. Instead, in this case, you really need those streaming instabilities in order to confine the cosmic rays around the sources and then to give you an effective suppression of their diffusion. So are really two different mechanisms at play. And what I will argue is that in any case, whatever you will do, you should always take into account the effect that I'm talking about here, because otherwise your diffusive propagation is not even correct as a hypothesis.
No, yeah. Since you were talking about the flux tube, I was thinking to the non-resonance instability. But
I see. No, it's much more simple than that at the moment. So those are complicated scenarios that probably we will consider in the future. But at the moment, we are just computing with effective also morphologies. So I have another slide here. So in the transitional regime, the angular distribution is just modulated with effective form functions. So we are not really considering the morphology of also the flux tubes.
Okay, I see. And last curiosity is what you mean exactly with ballistic? Is just a velocity of C, or there is any background magnetic field? So it's a sort of gyration motion, or?
Yes, so I would say that you should follow the particles in a ballistic motion in the sense that they will be deflected by the magnetic field, if any, if they are charged particles, but their propagation is not isotropized yet. So you will not be able to use the assumption of isotropic diffusion in a volume, let's say. So you will really need to propagate them in a ballistic way.
Okay, I see. Well, I don't have any question. Maybe Johan had one, or maybe I stole his question.
Yeah, actually, it was a related question, but you partly answered it. It's about more the technicality of this transition regime. Do you? So I think you've shown the formula at the end, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe just to say, if you can say a few words about that.
Yes, so this is a super effective model that was presented by Prozekin and Aronian a few years ago in order to take into account this transition. So you have this function that is accounting for your modification in the angular distribution. And then what you are doing is just basically to multiply your density of electrons by this morphology factor that is depending by different parameters that are also depending on the line of sight. So this is really not an effective treatment at the moment. This was working for the system that they were interested in. And the point is that it's really difficult to solve those equations in a self-consistent way in
Yes,
the relativistic
yes.
regime. So you need to rely on some approximation. At the moment, we don't have a
Of course.
better way of doing that.
Okay, okay, no, very good. Thank you very much. And maybe a last very small curiosity. So slide 31. So on the scheme, it's written ISM density gradient. Why does that matter here? So if you can, so in the first panel, then ISM density gradient.
Yes, so this is because in this model, what they were looking at was the energy density of the interstellar medium as a possible division line between pulsar wind nebula and halos. So they needed also to define in which direction this density gradient was and to compare the density, the energy density of the interstellar medium with the energy density that you find inside the halo. But I didn't produce this image, so
Okay.
I'm not qualified to comment much more.
No, very good. So just to know if it mattered for you or not.
Yeah, this was really in their model to express what they believe will be a possible stage 1, 2, and 3 pulsar, let's say.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we should stop here, but thank you so very much, Silvia. This was super interesting, as I said. Thanks, everyone, for staying with us. And
for having me.
Yeah, of course. And yeah, thanks. Yeah. And I'll see you in a couple of weeks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Silvia. Nice talk. Bye-bye.